Good evening, my fellow Americans. I have asked for this television time tonight to report to you on our most difficult and urgent problem, the war in Vietnam. Since I took office 4 months ago, nothing has taken so much of my time and energy as the search for a way to bring lasting peace to Vietnam. I know that some believe that I should have ended the war immediately after the inauguration by simply ordering our forces home from Vietnam. This would have been an easy thing to do. It might have been a popular thing to do. But I would have betrayed my solemn responsibility as President of the United States if I had done so. I want to end this war. I want to end this war. I want to end this war.
Under Nixon, the war in Vietnam would expand. Nixon would also secretly create a covert war in Cambodia without the public or Congress's knowledge. He would militarize Cambodians as well as drop bombs on regions of Cambodia without the public or Congress's knowledge. He did this in order to circumnavigate any political hardship of winning over support in Congress, as well as to avoid any more protests or distaste from the public. Nixon would eventually be exposed for this after an insider at the Pentagon decided to leak this secret information to the press. This leak of information eventually became known as the Pentagon Papers.
In Boston, Dr. Daniel Ellsberg, the man named as the source of the Pentagon copy that appeared in the New York Times, turned himself in today to federal authorities. David Culhane reports.
Even if the FBI had wanted to arrest him outside the courthouse this morning, they probably couldn't have done it. Ellsberg was walled off by a mob of newsmen and supporters as he admitted that he was indeed the man who brought the Pentagon Papers to the press and congressional leaders.
I can no longer cooperate in concealing this information from the American public. I did this clearly at my own jeopardy, and I am prepared to answer to all the consequences of these decisions.
Nothing else of interest in the world?
Yes, sir. Very significant, this goddamn New York Times expose of the most highly classified documents of the war.
Oh, that. I see. I didn't read the story, but you mean that was leaked out of the Pentagon?
The New York Times had begun publishing a trove of secret documents called the Pentagon Papers, exposing how president after president had misled the American people about their country's role in escalating the Vietnam War.
What in the world do responsible publishers think about to put out trunkloads of secret documents?
It's getting worse every day.
It's awful, isn't it?
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Finally, I feel that Richard Nixon and his loved ones have suffered enough and will continue to suffer no matter what I do, no matter what we as a great and good nation can do together to make his goal of peace come true. Now, therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from July 20, 1969 through August 9, 1974.
By 10 o'clock this morning, he had concluded it really was all over. He called Carter, and an hour and 15 minutes later, his family with him, Gerald Ford came to the White House press room to make the first concession statement of his political career.
It's perfectly obvious that my voice isn't up to par, and I shouldn't be making very many comments, and I won't. I think all of us Betty, the children, and myself would like to just come down and shake hands and express our appreciation personally. Let me call on the real spokesman for the family, Betty.
It's been the greatest honor of my husband's life to have served his fellow Americans during two of the most difficult years in our history. The President urges all Americans to join him in giving your united support to President-elect Carter as he prepares to assume his new responsibilities.
The three major responsibilities that Carter would adopt as president would be first and foremost attempting to regain the trust of Americans when it came to the President of the United States and the government as a whole. After the Vietnam War and the following president lying about negotiations as well as operations of the Vietnam War, many Americans had low morale and many Americans felt like they were betrayed as well as had no reason to trust the government. It was on Carter to attempt to try to mend these bonds and recultivate this relationship between government and its people. The number two most important thing for Carter's administration would be trying to create a solution for the growing energy crisis. For years, the United States' demand for resources increased exponentially, whereas production for resources did not go in line with the needs. Eventually, it was not even possible for the United States to import needed resources due to cost. Now, the third, and possibly tied to the other 2 points responsibility that Carter would have to address, would be the economy. Unemployment had grown rapidly, inflation had grown rapidly, and it seemed like the energy crisis was tied in with all these things, along with a lower GDP, and because of stagflation and the energy crisis, a very weak economy. It would be on Carter to create job opportunities as well as financial policies to try to cultivate an immediate stop to the bleeding, and try to build back better with solutions that were long-lasting as well as could be implemented within his term. As we'll go on, you'll see that these 3 points are motifs of Carter's presidency. Not only would these be important points coming into office, but during his presidency they would only grow in nature. Eventually they would become so large and Carter's actions would seem so minuscule that the American people would not come out to support him the way they did during his first election. Carter would actually only serve 1 term and eventually be upended by Ronald Reagan in the next presidential election. From Carter's administration to Reagan's to Bush and onward, Carter's time in America would be seen as a mending period for Americans, but not many thanks would be given to Carter. Many people, to this day, have looked at Carter as an example of a failed administration, someone who's not able to execute on their promises, and it seems like many Americans during the time period of Carter's administration had a distaste and dislike for Carter that seemed to be a combination of hate for Nixon as well as Ford mixed in together. And it seems like Carter was someone who was too proud or perhaps too patriotic to simply resign or have his wife speak for him. He was there to take the brunt of the force and the full force of this hatred. And I'd like to simply examine the actions of Carter, his presidency, and the hardships that followed, and create a picture of the circumstances that were thrown at Carter during his presidency, as well as the hatred and dislike that he experienced during that time.
The American dream endures. We must once again have full faith in our country and in one another. I believe America can be better. We can be even stronger than before. Let our recent mistakes bring a resurgent commitment to the basic principles of our nation. For we know that if we despise our own government, we have no future.
In April of 1967, hundreds of thousands of anti-war protesters marched in New York City. But most Americans still supported the war, and criticizing U.S. policy on Vietnam remained politically treacherous, especially for African Americans. Meanwhile, Muhammad Ali's lawyers had delayed his induction date by claiming the boxer resided in Houston, where he had trained for his recent fights. Now, a new order required him to report to local draft board number 47 in Houston at 8:30 a.m. on April 28th. Before he left Louisville, Ali gave a press conference explaining his position and his plans.
Why should me and other so-called Negroes go 10,000 miles away from home here in America to drop bombs and bullets on other innocent brown people who's never bothered us? And I will say directly, no, I will not go 10,000 miles to help or kill innocent people.
5 days later, Muhammad Ali, flanked by his lawyers, arrived at the old post office building in Houston. Inside, as Ali underwent his physical, he joked with his fellow recruits, demonstrating the Ali shuffle in his underwear. Then, at the induction ceremony, Ali refused to step forward when his name was called. A Navy lieutenant explained the penalty should he be found guilty of refusing induction: a $10,000 fine and up to 5 years in prison. Given another chance to step forward, Ali refused again.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Muhammad Ali has just refused to be inducted into the United States Armed Forces.
The reaction was swift and severe.
January 1977. One of the first actions by Jimmy Carter is to pardon draft dodgers of the Vietnam War. As mentioned, the Vietnam War had extremely low morale, so much so that military service members would and execute their commanding officers in a way to protest their distaste for the war. Multiple individuals, some of high regard and popularity, such as Muhammad Ali, would publicly protest the war, saying that they would not join the military and would dodge the draft or avoid it because they believed it was immoral and unjust. And by Carter pardoning these individuals and not persecuting them, it essentially put to bed and laid rest the intricacies and controversies that surrounded the Vietnam War, and it was closure and a conclusion to this period. Carter also passes the Emergency Natural Gas Act, which gives more powers to the executive branch when it comes to creation as well as transferring of natural gas and oil. It essentially gave the president the ability to construct new oil pipelines, transfer oil from one pipeline to another, and basically just allowed for better organization and faster optimization for natural gas use in areas of the nation that needed it. Again, the United States was facing a natural energy crisis, and Carter's attempt to organize it better was his first stab at remediating it. December 31st, 1977. Jimmy Carter would visit Iran, remarking it as an island of stability.
Iran, because of the great leadership of the Shah, is an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world. This is a great tribute to you, Your Majesty, and to your leadership, and to the respect and the admiration and love which your people give to you.
Now, this would be extremely ironic, as during Carter's administration, the fall of the Iranian government would occur, as well as a revolution that would affect the United States negatively. But this is something to keep in mind, that at the beginning of the presidency, Carter looked to the Middle East as an area of stability and something that was controllable, and as his presidency would continue, it would become less and less stable.
This is CBS News Special Report. From Washington, here is Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. The committee summit at Camp David is over, and Israel and Egypt have agreed to 2 documents taking a giant step toward achieving peace in their troubled corner of the world. Israel has agreed to end its military government on the west bank of the Jordan River and to permit Palestinian self-rule there within 5 years, and to withdraw from the Sinai and to establish normal relations with Egypt. President Carter, President Sadat, and Israeli Prime Minister Begin have now helicoptered down to the White House from Camp David and are about to appear in the East Room there to report to the nation and to the world.
Carter mediates a peace talk between Israel, Palestine, and Egypt during a 2-week summit. In order to achieve this, he took a monumental amount of time, 2 weeks, in order to discuss the different geopolitical as well as war actions that had occurred in the region, and Carter did this in an attempt to further stabilize the Middle East. He had looked at Iran as an island of stability, and now he had hoped to make Israel, Egypt, as well as Palestine stable, peaceful, and more organized in a fashion that would not beset war or more conflict in the region. As a result of the Camp David Accords, Egypt was actually given parts of land back that was taken by Israel during war, and in return, Egypt then recognized Israel as a nation, and they then went on to have regular diplomatic relations. This was a huge win for Carter, and it then again solidified his stance that the Middle East and the Persian Gulf was a stable region.
I might say that this document encompasses almost all of the issues between the two countries and resolves those issues. A few lines remain to be drawn on maps, and the question of the settlements is to be resolved. Other than that, most of the major issues are resolved already in this document, and we will now sign this document as well.
October 15th, 1978, Congress passes the Energy Bill and the Employment Bill, which is backed and signed by Carter, and both of these legislative entities exist to try to remediate the biggest crises that was affecting the nation at the time, that being the energy crisis, the unemployment crisis, and inflation crisis. The Energy Bill specifically looked to create more renewable energy as well as conserve more energy through legislative measures. It does this by funding more renewable sources of energy, such as solar energy, and it also mandated and created new laws through the EPA that forced car companies, for example, to increase their fuel mileage. That made their average miles per gallon go from 14 in 1977 to 20 in 1980. And this is something the government still continues to do and aims to do in order to decrease fuel needs and keep energy in check. Now, for the employment bill, the main apparatus for this bill is to lower inflation without spiking unemployment. This eventually, historically, would be seen to be extremely hard to do because usually the countermeasure for inflation is the increase of interest rates. Currently, it is March 2024, and that is something that can be seen in the world around us today. Due to 2020 inflationary processes and policies, we now have higher interest rates, the average being 7% for mortgage interest rates, for example. And during this time period of 1977 to 1980, in order to counteract the extreme inflation measures, the Federal Reserve had to increase interest rates to a whopping 18%, the highest interest rate increase seen post-war era. This led to a 10% increase in unemployment, which directly affected and directly negated contents of the employment bill, which aimed to have an unemployment rate of 3% or lower for individuals of the age 20 or older, as well as have inflation 3% or lower by the year 1988. This ended up not being possible, and the only way to rein in inflation was to increase interest rates, which then caused larger unemployment, as well as stagflation and market recession. This was unfortunately a very difficult economic period, and it is something that Carter had to face head on, had to take accountability and responsibility for, and something that eventually would essentially define his presidency, which is a terrible economy. July 15th, 1979, a very important date, as this would be the day that Carter would deliver his national address that eventually would be known as a crisis of confidence or malaise speech to the United States of America.
I promise you a president who is not isolated from the people, who feels your pain and who shares your dreams and who draws his strength and his wisdom from you. During the past 3 years, I've spoken to you on many occasions about national concerns, the energy crisis, reorganizing the government, our nation's economy, and issues of war, and especially peace. But over those years, the subjects of the speeches, the talks, and the press conferences have become increasingly narrow, focused more and more on what the isolated world of Washington thinks is important. Gradually, you've heard more and more about what the government thinks, or what the government should be doing, and less about our nation's hopes, our dreams, and our vision of the future. I began to ask myself the same question that I now know has been troubling many of you. Why have we not been able to get together as a nation to resolve our serious energy problem? It's clear that the true problems of our nation are much deeper than gasoline lines or energy shortages, deeper even than inflation or recession. And I realize more than ever that as president, I need your help. So I decided to reach out and to listen to the voices of America. I invited to Camp David people from almost every segment of our society, business and labor, teachers and preachers, governors, mayors, and private citizens. And then I left Camp David to listen to other Americans, men and women like you. It has been an extraordinary 10 days. And I want to share with you what I've heard. First of all, I got a lot of personal advice. Let me quote a few of the typical comments that I wrote down. This is from a Southern governor. Mr. President, you're not leading this nation. You're just managing the government. If you lead, Mr. President, we will follow.
This would be one of many speeches that Carter would have with the nation, where he would wear his heart on his sleeve, try to have a heart-to-heart with individuals and be bluntly honest and say that there is a crisis of confidence. There is an issue where citizens as well as the government are not coming to the table and doing as much as they can, and that it's not as simple to say that the economy, the military, or the country is having issues. It is that there is a morale issue. There is a problem with the idea that we all need to work together and come to terms with producing results. Now, this was not met with the same love and fervor as when John F. Kennedy said, "Do not ask what your government can do for you, but what you can do for your government." Instead, people looked at it as Carter shirking responsibility, not taking accountability, and essentially, as more and more of these speeches would occur and more events would take place, a lot of confidence would be lost in Carter, despite him trying his best to be honest and forthcoming, and even taking it to an extreme that after this speech, 5 days later, on July 18th, 1979, Carter would actually have 5 cabinet members removed because he believed they were not doing as much as they could and they needed to be replaced. He removed the Attorney General, Secretary of Health, of Education and Energy, the Treasury, and he was essentially cleaning house in order to try to create a better cabinet, a better government, and essentially yield better results. As Carter's administration and presidency would continue, more and more issues would arise. But remember the date, July 15th, 1979, as when Carter tried to reach out to the nation and be honest, he was met with distaste, disgust, and distrust, and this would become a motif for his presidency. September 1979. The summer had ended and the fall had come. In more ways than one, Carter's approval rating was the lowest of any president in the past 30 years. His approval rating teetered between the high teens and low 20s, where 80%, an overwhelming majority of Americans, felt dissatisfied, disgusted, and underrepresented by the government and Carter himself. In a Washington Post article, Carter would remark that he felt like he could not do anything that was a winning move, as any deal or proposal that he would create political opponents on either side, where if he were to try to create stricter energy constraints and bills to be passed through Congress, oil companies and others would look at him as an austere authoritarian. At the same time, these bills and actions didn't have much action in the immediate in remediating high gas prices for citizens, so there was no real net positive to be seen in the here and now. What's ironic is that Carter was actually getting a little bit of leeway being given to him by a Republican senator named John Danforth, who said in a speech, he suggested that we let up on the President Carter. He said he was terribly concerned about the incessant drumfire of criticism directed at the president. He also mentions that we have overdone the criticism, that it has been too unrelenting, and that we have impaired the man's capacity to fulfill his responsibilities. And this is something that is agreeable not only from the actions and the remarks coming from Carter in his speeches, where he's trying to level the playing field and speak heart to heart with citizens, it's also seen extremely well by the reaction of citizens and the press when Carter makes mistakes, even ones that seemingly have not much effect on citizens themselves, as a moment to scoff and gaffe and laugh at the president and his misgivings. One such example would be in the same month of September, when Carter had collapsed in a 10K race, and the media and citizens took a moment to laugh at the president for not being able to complete a race. Sports Illustrated even saying that the president was a bit brash and a bit too overconfident to go out on a run like this in his old age when he has low approval rating as a president. It's also mentioned in the New York Times that the president was white, ashen, and looked like he was about to die while on the trail, and multiple publications pointed out that Carter was old, seemed sick, and wasn't able to continue on. And even one White House press secretary mentions that some of Carter's allies and friends mentioned that if you're going to start this race, you better well finish it. And of course, he was not able to. But it really is something to take into consideration and understand that Carter was scrutinized to such a degree that someone having a somewhat common medical emergency was somehow taken to the degree of saying that his weakness in a race is the same as his weakness as president, and that it's not only that he's a bad leader of a nation, but as an individual he's a failure, to the point that he himself cannot even maintain the speed necessary to complete a simple race. Now, unfortunately for Carter, these existing criticisms would only grow worse. And even more unfortunate for Carter is what would happen in the following months would not only affect his presidency in the short term, but the American idea and viewpoint of Carter for years to come. Because in November of 1979, Carter would face his biggest threat as president and biggest issue he did not expect seeing. As he mentioned in the past, he said that Iran was an island of stability. And it seems like this island of stability had just been appended, flipped over, and turned and run amok, because Carter's island of stability had now become a hot, violent revolution.
Some 60 Americans, including our fellow citizen whom you just saw bound and blindfolded, are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. It's Friday morning there now. But throughout this night in Washington, officials will continue their search for some way to negotiate the hostages' freedom. That search was not successful today. In this broadcast, we'll have reports on the diplomatic efforts to resolve the problem and on other aspects of the crisis as well. But we begin now with an on-the-scene account by the one American television correspondent who has been there since the beginning, the seizure of the embassy last Sunday, and who, with his crew, has provided us with outstanding coverage all this week. Here is Bob Dyke in Tehran.
This picture tells it all. This flag was apparently taken from someone's office inside the United States Embassy. It was burned Tuesday evening outside the embassy's gates. To the Iranian demonstrators who set fire to it, this was a symbol of victory. 2 days earlier, several hundred young people, mainly students at Tehran University, had taken over the embassy. We are not occupiers, they said. We have thrown out the occupiers. But instead of chasing all the Americans out of the compound, the Iranians imprisoned them in a building somewhere on these grounds. They have been hostages ever since. This morning, for the first time since the hostages were put under lock and key, one of the captives, blindfolded, was brought out into the open.
He is Harry Rosen, the embassy's press attaché.
He was turned to face reporters and cameramen and several hundred Iranian demonstrators outside the embassy's gates. "Yankee, go home," they cried, but they made no attempt to harm him. Eventually, he was led back to join the other captives who have been kept out of sight. It was another small victory for the activists who are fully backed by their country's supreme ruler, the Ayatollah Khomeini. It seems the Iranian students have the initiative. The next move is evidently up to the United States. Ever since the Shah fled the country last January, there has been a persistent belief in many quarters here in Iran that the United States government was not only in deep sympathy with the deposed ruler and his family, but plotting to restore him to power here, to bring back the Pahlavi dynasty and the imperial court. America's investment here was considerable before the Shah's downfall, billions of dollars spent, much of it for defense. Iran's Army and Air Force, equipped with the latest sophisticated military hardware, including Phoenix missiles and F-14s, was considered vital to Western security. Iran is bordered in the north by the Soviet Union, and American monitoring stations were deployed along the frontier. Despite the embassy takeover, with relations between the two countries never worse than now, Iran's oil pipelines to the U.S. are still open. For how long is for the Ayatollah to say.
By the end of 1979 and the beginning of 1980, Iran was extremely volatile and the situation was extremely unstable. Although the revolution did not start during the late term 1979 to 1980, it was the inflection point for Carter, as it was a confirmation of the failure of this degree, where it was confirmed that Carter had a mishandling of the situation and that it seemed like, regardless of his approach, it was not going to be a successful endeavor. As in early 1979, the Shah of Iran left Iran due to health concerns, and he asked for admittance into the United States. On this accord, Carter's administration refused admission, for the reason that they did not want to upset the revolutionaries into hurting the hostages, as well as not to add any type of added pressure to an already bad economy and bad energy sourcing. If Iran had chosen not to export oil to the United States, the situation for the local economy and the local energy crisis would only worsen. So in order to keep the foreign policy and the domestic policy friendly, the United States president at the time attempted to tactfully and slowly try to honor the obligations that was entangled between Iranian leader Shah and the United States. Now, this eventually would blow up internally as well as externally, as Harry Kissinger was an individual who was very gung-ho in bringing the Shah into the United States, saying that this is not how you treat an ally of the United States for the past 37 years. Later on, he would actually levy and successfully get the Shah admittance into Mexico, and from here, the Shah would argue that he was so sick that he should go to New York City for special treatment for his cancer. And not only did Kissinger levy for the Shah to go to Mexico and continue to levy for him to come to the United States, ex-President Richard Nixon actually got involved and visited the Shah in Mexico, saying that, again, an ally of the United States should not be shunned like this. The Carter administration tried to push back on this, saying that even with this health concern, it is not right to admit the Shah, as it would add even more stress to the Iranian revolution and even more instability to the Iran conflict. But after consideration and after seeing that the Shah was actually sick and that it seemed like adding him to the United States and having him in New York City would be a humanitarian effort, President Carter agreed in October of 1979, months later, that he would admit the Shah into the United States. This ended up causing the Iranian revolutionaries to see the United States as a secret benefactor of the Shah, someone who was trying to not only heal the Shah, but re-prop them up in Iran in order for stability and the previous administration to continue to support the United States. Again, this is one of those situations where Carter seemingly had no right decision to make and could only upset politicians internally as well as citizens externally, and it looked like a lose-lose scenario, as disrespecting the revolutionaries could potentially mean losing oil refineries and oil exports, and at the same time, if instability had occurred so much so that the Shah did return, and if shunned, the Shah would feel like being an ally with the United States was not fortuitous, and he may turn his sides to the USSR. Unfortunately, it seems like Carter chose the decision that was best at the time, but in all reality, there wasn't really a good answer at all. Quick aside, majority of this video has been event-driven, saying the events and how Carter reacted to them, but there is a political science question that is very important when it comes to the Shah of Iran and the Iranian Revolution. Critics of Carter said that Carter could have stopped the reign of the Ayatollah if he had not been so liberal in terms of allowing the Shah or forcing the Shah to release political prisoners, not killing opposition leaders, allowing freer elections, as well as giving a little bit too much democracy to the Shah and its people in a way that it allowed instability and eventually a revolution to occur. Now, this is a very complex subject, and your ideology may be strong one way or the other, but this criticism specifically is essentially American colonialism, similar to how the United States of America overthrew the democratically elected government of Chile in order to put in place a dictatorship that was more US sympathetic. Similarly, critics are saying that Jimmy Carter should have told the Shah to destroy any opposition, to not hold elections, to allow political prisoners to rot in prison if it meant a more stable dictatorship, if it meant better relations with the United States, essentially saying that it is okay to enact injustice and unfairness if it means more stable domestic policy and foreign relations. This is a very important question, ideologically as well as symbolically, because this kind of shows the mindset that Carter had, where he was not gung-ho in terms of forcing another nation to act a particular way. But it is very interesting because this is a huge criticism of Carter to say that he allowed the fall of Iran. November 1979. Carter finds himself in the middle of a foreign policy disaster. At this time, the Shah of Iran is being upended. His rule is now being violently questioned, and a revolution is forming in order to remove him and create a more democratic republican entity as opposed to the dictatorship of the Shah. At the same time, the United States now has to think of a strategic introduction to this new revolution action in order to not anger these individuals that have taken 150 American citizens as hostages. Carter now found himself in an odd balancing act of trying to support the Shah of Iran as an entity that was always a satellite state for the United States, and at the same time be sympathetic to the new revolutionaries in order to not lose favor with them and lose a potential bargaining chip when it comes to negotiating for the removal and retrieval of hostages. Now, as mentioned in the short summary before this, the Shah of Iran was sick. He actually had health complications. Eventually, he would go to the United States under the guise of receiving medical treatment, as well as the fact that the United States did want to continue backing the Shah and continue to have him as a U.S. ally. Also, a very important component of this is to keep in mind and remember that this is still during the age of the USSR. The Middle East was an important geographic area in order to try to control pieces of territory in order to stop the advance of communism. So not only is this the fall of the Iranian backing, but this is also the fall of a geopolitical piece that the United States had had for years that was a buffer state between Russia and the United States when it comes to the Cold War. Carter would inevitably end up being the individual to make the big decisions and be the individual who took responsibility and accountability for these decisions. And repeatedly, as in fashion, as in past, he had been seen as a failure and seen as someone who was not able to come up with the perfect solution. Not only did Carter anger individuals by being political and trying to approach the situation in Iran tactfully in terms of supporting the Shah, as well as not completely rejecting and disrespecting and enraging the new revolutionaries, Carter would later take actions in order to more drastically and more directly affect the Soviet Union, as well as create a potential possibility of more active warfare during the Cold War period. In January of 1980, Carter would have to address another foreign policy concern, the USSR. Earlier in the year, in June of 1979, Carter had signed an agreement with the USSR called the SALT II Treaty. This was the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which aimed to limit and decrease the nuclear capabilities of the United States as well as the USSR in order to de-escalate the Cold War. Now, after the USSR had invaded Afghanistan, Carter decided to pull out of the SALT agreement, stating that this was in a direct disagreement with the intentions of the act, and Carter would also go on to levy grain embargoes on the USSR, and later on, the United States would be part of a boycott of the Summer Olympics in Russia. This would continue to heat and advance the Cold War, as well as create a more unsettled feeling for citizens when it comes to the post-war era. Up until now, the Cold War's biggest failure for the United States was the Vietnam War. Ironically enough, for the USSR, it would end up being Afghanistan. But for the most part, most of the Cold War was fought with proxy wars. Now you can see the United States taking direct embargo action, as well as speaking directly about the USSR, and the fears that would come with this in terms of communism spreading westward from the USSR towards the Middle East, and eventually, potentially, to Europe, and potentially being a larger threat to the United States. Carter would also go on to say that he creates a doctrine called the Carter Doctrine, saying that the United States would protect oil interests in the Persian Gulf, including using military force.
An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force.
This would be something that is a statement similar to the Monroe Doctrine in the United States, where it essentially is verbalizing and explicitly stating something that is implicitly obvious, but for the point of saying it out loud in order to declare it to the world. The point being that the Middle East was an important asset to the United States, especially Iran, despite its current revolution and instability. At the same time, Carter wanted to make sure that the United States did not face any oil embargoes from the Middle East, as before the current crisis in 1973, due to a Middle East oil embargo on the United States, that had caused economic instability and energy insufficiency. So with the United States in a current economic slump, a current decline in energy, if the United States were to be hit with another oil embargo, potentially if Russia had gained control of a country that exported oil to the United States, it would be absolutely drastic and intolerable, to the point that warfare would actually look appealing. Again, Carter at this point in time was seen as an incompetent leader, someone who was taking the United States into a heated war as opposed to moving away from a Cold War, someone who could not still at this point in time retrieve and rescue hostages in Iran, could not save the economy with his policy, could not save citizens with his foreign policy, and it seemed like no matter what had cropped up and popped up, Carter would choose the wrong decision. Now, unfortunately, things would only get worse and worse for the United States as well as Carter. In April of 1980, Carter announces that the economy is officially in a recession. Inflation was at 10% and interest rates were at an astounding 18%. This was done by the Federal Reserve in order to attempt to negate and deflate the ridiculous inflation. Now remember, Carter had created an employment and energy bill earlier in his administration. The point of this bill was in order to create an apparatus that would decrease inflation while at the same time keeping unemployment rates lower for young Americans. Unfortunately, with the Fed's 18% interest rate, the economy had slowed down drastically in order to try to combat inflation, and at the same time, due to this economic decision, there was soaring unemployment. So not only had Carter seen inflation worsen, he saw interest rates worsen, and then you had seen unemployment worsen in order to create a trifecta of disgust and putridity that Americans saw as yet again another colossal failure by the Carter administration. With Carter's domestic failures being in the economy, interest, and unemployment, he also faced a failure on the foreign policy front when Desert One failure had occurred. Carter said that there was a mission by U.S. military personnel to go to Iran and attempt to rescue hostages. Unfortunately, this military operation was a failure, and there were military personnel casualties.
After my order to do so, 2 of our American aircraft collided on the ground following a refueling operation in a remote desert location in Iran. Other information about this rescue mission will be made available to the American people when it is appropriate to do so. There was no fighting, there was no combat, but to my deep regret, 8 of the crewmen of the 2 aircraft which collided were killed, and several other Americans were hurt in the accident. Our people were immediately airlifted from Iran. Those who were injured have gotten medical treatment, and all of them are expected to recover. No knowledge of this operation by any Iranian officials or authorities was evident to us until several hours after all Americans were withdrawn from Iran.
It's extremely important to take note here that Carter did not have to say this. As the executive officiator and the president and commander-in-chief of the military, he does not necessarily have to reveal all details of military interactions and operations, and in this particular situation, let's look at the facts. There was a staging area in Iran. There were multiple helicopters that were U.S. service member owned, and there was a disaster of some sort that caused a helicopter crash. U.S. service members had passed away, and from this, Carter decided to stop the rescue mission in order to prevent further casualties. Now, let's just imagine if it was a different president, and perhaps they only cared about their personal image. Now, in all reality, Carter or any other president does not have to divulge this information. This can be kept private. But Carter decided to share this because he wanted to share the atrocity or disaster that had occurred. He wanted to call out these service members and their families who had passed away. But what if another president only cared about their image? They would not say anything. As a matter of fact, they may continue to do more military operations with more casualties and only speak about the success. That you would never know that there were any military casualties unless they decided to share it. This is especially true after the Vietnam War, because there were laws passed in the United States that made it illegal for even press to go to the airport and document the number of bodies taken from Vietnam to the United States because it caused low morale. In this period, Carter could have taken the very gung-ho, austere position of saying we need to save these hostages. It's more important than killing multitude of military service members. And by the way, I won't ever mention that this occurred because to honor them would be to besmirch my own name. But Carter wasn't like that. He was someone who looked at accountability and responsibility squarely in the face and took it head on. And because of this, Americans hated him. Because of this, individuals such as myself would question, why ever be honest with people when they only view you for your weakness and only hate you because of it? Carter didn't have to say this, but it was in his character to do so. This is extremely important to remember, and a reminder that Carter's perceived hatred by Americans was due in part to the fact that he was honest, didn't mince words, and didn't lie to the public. Again, Carter faces failure. Not only does he look like a weak leader when it comes to domestic issues, but on the foreign front, he also seems to be a complete failure from the American perspective. June of 1980, Carter's approval rating is officially the worst of any president since 1945. This is really saying something when you consider the fact that the previous president to Carter was Gerald Ford, who was only president because Nixon, a crook who lied to the United States and Congress, had stepped down. Carter was extremely hated on every front. When it came to politics, to support Carter was to besmirch your own image. And when it came to regular everyday Americans, the head of state, the individual who seemingly was in charge of leading the nation, seemed to be someone who was not able to accomplish much of anything. Later on in the summer, in July of 1980, Carter would sign a presidential directive allowing for limited use of nuclear warfare. This would be something that would be another signal and another sign of the Cold War heating up with Russia, and potentially another sign of Carter mismanaging the nation and leading it into war when it already had faced a poor economy as well as poor foreign policy decisions and foreign policy events. Unfortunately for Carter, this would be his last major decision, as in November of 1980, he would lose the election in a landslide defeat. Only 6 states, along with the District of Columbia, would vote for Carter. 44 would vote for Ronald Wilson Reagan. Reagan would dominate with 489 electoral votes to Carter's measly 49. Carter, at this point in time, was seen as a complete and utter failure. Not only a failure in the sense of someone who was not able to remediate the issues of the nation, but really not even able to finish his approach to remediating it. At this point in time, his island of stability of Iran was now rife with revolution, as well as hostages that were still stuck in the Iranian nation. At the same time, Carter's presidency had come in with inflation, unemployment, and interest rates at an astronomical high, and he had left it worse than what he had started. It seemed like the president could do no good and only could do harm. It's also very important to remember and understand that this would be an inflection point in larger American politics. This would be seen as a huge flipping point when it comes to Americans and their general ideology and their viewpoint of the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party, especially in terms of leaning towards Reagan's silent majority of more conservative Americans. Reagan would continue on taking this nation out of the issues it faced in terms of foreign policy and foreign events, as well as turning the economy around slowly based off the building blocks that had occurred from the past administration. But any success and wins would go straight to Reagan, and any type of building or formation or path forward that was created by Jimmy Carter would be seen as a simple happenstance as opposed to him doing anything at all. I think it's very important to realize that Carter's administration is seen as a failure then and is seen as a failure now. It's also a very interesting approach and a statement to how Americans and individuals view leadership in general. Because as I just said, Reagan had won this election in a landslide victory. What's even more shocking is that Reagan's next election was an even more dominating victory. He would win 49 states as opposed to the 44 previously. This would be a reaffirmation that Reagan's ideology and his conservative mindset was something that Americans wanted more of, which is why they then went on to vote for George Bush Sr. Aside from this, I think it's very important to look at the ideological differences between Carter and Reagan, because I think their leadership style, just from a surface level, tells you a lot about the American psychological point, a lot about the American psychological viewpoint. Reagan was someone who would lie incessantly. Whether you can look at his success objectively or look at it subjectively, Reagan, much like Nixon, had conducted a secret war without Congress's knowledge, the difference being that when it came to the Contra scandal, he had an individual named Oliver North who fell on the sword for him. Regardless, Reagan was an individual that pushed the boundaries of the executive branch, lying and cheating and using his sweet talk in order to get political items pushed through, regardless of how it affected Americans in the long term. It's also very important to realize that Carter was someone who was extremely honest, someone who attempted to talk to Americans directly. Regardless, if you look at the approaches of these individuals, you can see 2 distinct leadership approaches where Carter had tried to be extremely transparent, someone who tried to be as clear and as vocal about his decisions and his point of view, as well as how he came to the decision that he created. Whereas Reagan and presidents that have followed do not tell you what they are thinking or what motivated them to do something. It's much more important to look like you know what you're doing as opposed to actually doing the correct thing. I think it's something that is very disgusting as well as something that's extremely interesting, because if you look at Carter's administration and see the hatred that was directed towards him, despite him being a president that had just followed a liar, a crook, and following a complete crybaby who simply sat there and said he needed to absolve the previous president Nixon of his justified criminal case because he had believed that he had suffered just too much. It seemed like Americans were more infatuated with how they felt with Carter as opposed to what he actually did to them. Because in all reality, the economy was bad when Carter came to office. Unemployment was bad when Carter came to office. The Cold War had existed when Carter came to office. The interest rate issue was an economic policy that was unavoidable, regardless of whether Carter was or was not in office. It seemed that Carter was dealt a hand of cards that would never work in any table, in any game, and any reality or any possibility. With every turn was a failure waiting to happen, and at no point in time would any type of progress or action that led to progress be attributed to him. It seemed like Carter's failure was so much more pronounced and so much more stinging because he had been there the full 4 years, and at no point in time did he try to weasel his way out of accountability. Where Nixon had hid behind Gerald Ford had hid behind the Constitution, saying that it was within his executive duty to pardon the previous president. Carter would say that he was responsible, that he was accountable, and that he had tried diligently to resolve issues in a manner that would beseech and help every American, which in itself is not possible. I think from a historical perspective, Carter's presidency is an extremely interesting period because it's a period that is really an inflection point, not only from a president's perspective, but an American perspective, where it is a period where the United States was the weakest morale-wise, economic-wise, as well as foreign policy-wise, and it really is something to take into consideration that had it not been for Carter being president at that time, and Reagan were to be there, would he have succeeded and dominated in the same fashion? Would it be a question of Reagan being a adopter of the good foundation that Carter had left him? Or is it simply the case that Carter was a bad leader, and that no matter how good the nation was, Carter would not do much of anything, and given a bad case, he could not do anything but make it worse? I think that looking at this historical perspective is extremely enlightening, as well as extremely unfortunate, because it was a period of extreme low morality in the United States, as well as a period of inflection points in multiple degrees. This video talked about the foreign as well as economic policies, but did not touch on the larger and growing issues of racial discrimination, as well as women's rights activism and other social movements that had occurred during the period. It also glossed over the different ways that Americans were affected by this bad economy or policies, such as African American individuals being the first individuals drafted to war, and then when returning to America, not being given the same privileges as other Americans, such as being excluded from the GI Bill. Again, this video is focusing on Carter and the events that were related to Carter, but there's no such thing as a microcosm when it comes to the geopolitical landscape of the United States or the world in general. There's multiple issues that occurred during this time period. There's multiple items that contributed to Carter's issues. And unfortunately, seems like a lot of the issues have fallen directly on Carter's head. And despite him trying to take it on head on and do his best, he unfortunately came up short and forever will be remembered as a president that was a nice person, a really great guy, but you really wouldn't want him as a leader.
At the end of every single video, make sure you ask people to rate and subscribe to your content. It makes them feel like they're involved even though they're really not. And most importantly, make sure they comment on every single video. If you have to, disguise it. You know, call it something like the question of the day. And really make them think you're gonna really read it when you really don't have to. Ha ha ha!